Hello, this is Stephen Schwiff, Professor of History at Columbia Gorge Community College. This is the introduction to the study of history, which I am recommending all my students listen to and watch. It will go over the basic ideas of why do we study history and some things for us to consider, as well as one popular theory about the study of history. Why study history? On this page, we see many quotes from historians throughout the ages, and they summarize much of the opinion about the study of history. So let's go through them one by one. First, the great historian, Roman historian Cicero, who says that history is a witness that testifies to the passing of time. It illumines reality, vitalizes memory, provides guidance in daily life, and brings us tidings of antiquity. Now this idea is that history benefits us by giving us a greater knowledge of the past, of what makes humans human. Now the counter to this view of history is by Edward Gibbon, the great historian of the popular history, The Decline and Fall of Roman History, who wrote right around the time of our founding in the United States. Edward Gibbon said, "History is little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortune of mankind." And this is often the view I receive from students who say, just tell me what happened. Well, as we'll learn in this course, we don't know exactly what happened. It's much interpretation, it's much of your own view, your own prejudices, and your own ideas of what may or may not have occurred. Now, some facts we know, others have been distorted over time, but what I like to get into is the story of history, the narration, the actions of individual people, and you'll see that as we go forward this semester as well. Now, George Bernard Shaw, this quote here, is based on much of what we've heard. I've heard this attributed to many people. He says Hegel. I've heard it attributed to Abraham Lincoln. But he says Hegel was right when he said that we learn from history that man can never learn anything from history. And this is the idea that despite all our efforts, man will continue to make the same mistakes, often disastrous mistakes, despite the lessons of history. Now, George Santayana also has a well-quoted phrase about history: those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And once again, this is the idea that we can learn from history how to behave in the future and be more successful than our ancestors. Henry Ford, the great industrialist, said history is more or less bunk. It's tradition. We don't want tradition. We want to live in the present, and the only history that is worth a tinker's damn in history is the history we made today. Of course, this is, once again, a very narrow view of what history can offer. John W. Gardner said history never looks like history when you're living through it. And once again, this is another theme of our course, which is getting our own mindset in tune to the people of the time. Now, we can often say, of course, World War I was inevitable. World War II was inevitable. The founding of our country, the emergence of our founding fathers. But this is a view from looking backwards. And as I've said many times, hindsight is 20/20. Once we know where history is going, once we've seen what happens in history, we can predict that was going to happen. But that's very rarely the case. There's often turning points, many turning points, some small, some big, that could have led us in a very different path. And we'll explore those as we go along. Now, Josh Greenberg talks about history in the digital age. He writes, if you write a post and put it on a blog, that's a historical document. If you change your template, then that entry looks completely different. It's the same with words, but it's not the same meaning. This all depends on what historical questions that people will be asking, and we can't know what they will want. And so in the digital age, things are so temporary, so transient, that historians may suffer in the future. For example, we can look back and see Thomas Jefferson's drafts of the Declaration of Independence. We know that Benjamin Franklin suggested inevitable rights, and that has come down to us as one of the most enduring passages in American history. Now, without that record, we wouldn't know the history, we wouldn't know the human story behind so much. Imagine each of you as you write your papers on word processors, that you change phrases, change sentences, change whole paper structure, and the end result is the only document that we have to look at, or the future has to look at. So all the rough drafts, all those ideas that may have led to very valid conclusions are gone. And we often find in history that the mistakes people make are the ones that lead to great inventions and great moments in history. Napoleon Bonaparte and Sir Winston Churchill, two historical figures that also cared very much about history, have counterpoint on those last two quotes. First, Napoleon, history is a version of past events that people have decided to agree upon. And Churchill, maybe playing off that idea that history is what people decide to agree on, says, history will be kind to me, I intend to write it, saying that he will create the history that people will agree on in the future. And this, once again, is the view that I'd like you to consider as you go through this semester. What is history? What is the story that we're learning about history? And does it pass the plausibility test? Or are there other factors? And as we go through, we'll be discussing various ideas of history, what may have motivated the founding fathers, what may have motivated the kings and emperors of Europe, and we'll see whether we accept that as the history that's been handed down, or we want to look at a different view. 6 questions to consider. First, is there meaning to history? Do we learn from history? Are there consequences to our failure to learn from history? This plays off several of the quotes that we had just talked about. But how important is the study of history, and what do we derive as individuals and as a society from the study of history? Second, is freedom a universal value? If so, and I think most of us in the United States would certainly view freedom as a universal value. If so, why is world history largely a story of tyranny, misery, and war? And in every history course that we'll go through, we'll see these problems. And whether freedom is a universal value or not is a personal belief for each of us to hold. But we need to see how that plays out throughout history. Third, why has the history of the world seen the rise and falls of superpowers and empires? Why has the Middle East been throughout history the crucible of conflict and the graveyard of empires? Fourth, what did the lessons of history teach us about the destiny of a nation that is both a democracy and a superpower, such as ancient Greece, Republican Rome, the 20th century United States, and a few others? We'll see that many of the countries that are claiming democracy, and thus at least political freedom for its citizens, often take on the role of superpower throughout the world. And these ideas often conflict and often bring down those superpowers. Fifth, how do we distinguish between politician and statesman? And what makes a great leader in a time of crisis? We have many historical figures that we'll be discussing, many great leaders who seem to overcome their times and their crisis to make the world and make their countries a better place. But we also see other leaders that are not as great, that fail in their meaning. And what is the difference between a politician who holds office, who controls their country, and a statesman? And we'll be defining those as we go through this semester. And final question is 6. What will the wisdom of history teach later generation about our time and its place in history? And this will be an exercise not only to judge how we stand versus the historical nations and times, but also what we aspire to and what future generations will consider. And here, on the last slide of this PowerPoint, is one theory, the 10 fundamental lessons of history. And as you can see, they play off the questions. First, we do not learn from history. And this explains why history is the repeated pattern of struggle and freedom and success, and struggle again, and the return of monarchy despite republics being born and raised and maturing with the same emphasis as those revolutions. How do we explain the Republic of Rome becoming an empire, expansionist empire? How do we explain ancient Greece unifying against the deadly force of Persia and then splitting apart into its own civil war? And of course, the United States and what has happened as it's charted its course throughout history. Second, science and technology do not make us immune to the laws of history. And we often, or people at the time, often see science and technology as the next step to making the historical past obsolete. For example, in the early 1900s, people thought war would be a thing of the past because of the wire technology that allowed countries to communicate, and this quicker trains and steamships that allowed countries throughout the world to share in a global economy. And yet, when the guns of August of 1914 erupted, all the countries joined together to what was at the time the bloodiest war in in world history, World War I. And we too, with the internet and with the advances in ideas and science, believe that now we too are separated from the horrors of world wars, at least. Although we can see how very quickly we are vulnerable in events like 9/11 and the wars that erupted out of that in Afghanistan and Iraq that are just now coming to an end. Third, freedom is not a universal value. And in our discussion in the last PowerPoint, we looked at this idea, and we'll continue to discuss it and whether we see it as a universal value or not. This theory goes on with 4, that power is in fact the universal value. Fifth, the Middle East is a crucible of conflict and the graveyard of empires. In modern times, we see much of the trouble in the Middle East affecting world events, with Israel, Iraq, Afghanistan causing so much trouble. Rome also had their problems in these areas, and the great empire that fell apart. The Middle Ages is a constant struggle in the Middle East between the newly developed religion in the 500s of Islam versus the Christian nations of Western Europe. 6, the United States shares the destiny of the great democracies, republics, and the superpowers of the past. And so this theory links all of these great societies that we discuss together. 7, along with the lust for power, religion and spirituality are the most profound motivators in human history. And we'll see this as we examine what role religion has throughout our time and throughout history. Eight, great nations rise and fall because of human decisions made by individual leaders. Now, there's several different ideas of how you study history. This point seems to indicate that the great man idea, the great man version of history, study leaders and their decisions, and you can tell all you need to know about what history is about. While I pursue a global view of history, where we look at all the individuals and all the classes in history, including women, minority groups in different civilizations, and society as a whole, this view does indicate that many individual decisions are what shape history, not a global tide of historical events or global causation of historical facts. 9. The statesman is distinguished from a mere politician by 4 qualities: a bedrock of principle, a moral compass, a vision, and the ability to create a consensus to achieve that vision. Now we'll see that many leaders will hold several of these distinctions, but it takes a great man, a great statesman, to hold all 4. And as we go through the course, we'll look at these leaders and see how they meet and how they match up with this idea. And 10, throughout its history, the United States has charted a unique role in history. And we will look at this more in the U.S. history courses, but also in the world history course as the United States emerges on the world stage and the ideas that it represents, and whether that unique history and that unique place that America has provided in the world will be enough to avoid some of the pitfalls of the other great superpowers that have preceded us, or whether, as indicated in so many of these points, the United States will fall victim to the same problems of these great societies. Now these are just a few ideas, a few points on the study of history, but keep them in mind, come back to them, think about them, and apply the facts and the knowledge that you're going to learn throughout the semester to these points, point, counterpoint, see what you agree with and see what you differ from. Thank you.